The gold and silver pawn shop survived bankruptcy. Family lost.
For more than 15 years, one small building near downtown Las Vegas became one of the most recognized storefronts on television. Millions of people who never set foot in Nevada could still picture its neon sign, its cluttered glass counters, and a father and son duo who built an empire out of other people's junk drawers. So when a wave of headlines and comment sections started buzzing with the same claim in early 2026, that the gold and silver pawn shop was quietly being torn down, it spread fast. Fans shared it. Forums debated it. Some viewers even said they'd driven past and seen the fences and machinery for themselves. Here's the problem. It isn't true. Not even close. But understanding why so many people believed it means going back to where the story actually started long before cameras, before reality TV, and long before anyone called it Pawn Stars. The man who would eventually be known simply as the Old Man was born Richard Benjamin Harrison Jr. in the early 1940s in Virginia. Though he was raised in North Carolina, he wasn't a kid who followed a smooth, predictable path. He left school before finishing, and by his early teens, he was already behind the wheel of the school bus. As a teenager, he found himself in legal trouble after taking a car that wasn't his, the kind of mistake that in a small town with small-town judge could have gone very badly for him. Instead, the judge, who happened to be the father of a girl Richard was seeing, gave him an alternative: enlist or face the consequences in court. He chose the Navy, and that single decision shaped the next 2 decades of his life. He served for 20 years, worked his way up in rank, spent time on multiple ships, and did tours overseas during the Vietnam era. Somewhere in those years, despite being nowhere near old, he picked up a nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life, a nod to his steady, no-nonsense demeanor rather than his actual age. Family life brought both stability and heartbreak. Richard and his wife raised 4 children together, but their first daughter was born with Down syndrome and passed away as a young child. The medical costs tied to her care were part of the reason Richard chose to stay in the military longer than he might have otherwise, a decision that says a lot about the kind of provider he tried to be, even when it meant sacrificing his own plans. When he eventually left the service, the family settled into working life in Southern California, helped along by his wife's real estate career. For a while, things were steady, then the economy turned against them. Interest rates spiked to punishing levels in the early 1980s, and a business the family had built took a devastating hit, wiping out the better part of $1 million almost overnight. Left with only a small fraction of what they once had, the Harrisons made a decision that would eventually change reality television forever. They packed up and drove to Las Vegas. The first shop wasn't glamorous. It was a cramped few hundred square feet, opened by Richard and his teenage son Rick, dealing mostly in coins and second-hand goods. It was a foothold, nothing more. Over the following years, the business changed locations more than once, expanding a little and then losing ground, the way most small businesses do. Nothing about it looked destined for fame. The real turning point came when Rick discovered an old city ordinance limiting how many pawn licenses Las Vegas could issue, tied directly to population growth. Rather than treat this as a dead end, he became fixated on it, repeatedly checking in with city officials to see whether the population had crossed the threshold that would free up a new license. When it finally did, the family moved immediately, securing a pawn license and opening at the Las Vegas Boulevard address that would eventually become instantly recognizable to millions of viewers. For the next 2 decades, the shop operated the way most pawn shops do, unnoticed by anyone outside the neighborhood. Open around the clock, lending cash to gamblers who needed just enough to get home and buying whatever came through the door. What set it apart wasn't flash. It was Rick's growing fascination with objects that had strange histories attached to them, old coins, historic memorabilia, oddities most other shops wouldn't bother appraising. That curiosity gave the place a personality long before a camera crew ever showed up. Small media appearances started to trickle in over the years. A documentary segment here, a late-night travel show cameo there, and Rick kept pushing to turn the shop into something bigger, a full television show. Most people who heard the pitch passed. One serious offer came close, but it wanted something far grittier and stranger than what Rick had in mind, so he walked away from it. The breakthrough came when 2 New York-based producers visited Las Vegas on a casual trip and stumbled onto the shop while searching for a family-run business that could anchor a new reality series. They brought the concept to a cable network eager to expand beyond its usual programming. And the pitch reportedly succeeded almost by accident, a broken DVD player forcing them to borrow one from a passing executive, who watched the reel and greenlit on the spot. The show went through a few identity changes before it found its final name, a playful, attention-grabbing twist meant to stand out in a crowded schedule. Once it added rotating outside experts to appraise and explain the history behind each item, it found a format that would define it: part comedy, part family drama, part impromptu history lesson. When it premiered in the summer of 2009, nobody could have predicted what came next. Within weeks, it was a top-rated show on its network. Within about a year and a half, it had become the highest-rated program in that network's history. At its peak, single episodes were pulling in more viewers than almost anything else on cable television, competing directly with major broadcast hits and even besting long-running wrestling programming in the same week. For several years running, it consistently ranked among the very top shows on all of ad-supported cable. Success snowballed. Rick wrote a best-selling memoir. City officials handed the cast ceremonial honors. A whole county eventually declared an unofficial holiday in the shop's name. Multiple spin-off shows followed, chasing the same format with different subjects: car restoration, historical relics, look-alike shops overseas. By the time the flagship series had aired several hundred episodes, it was broadcasting in well over 100 countries and translated into dozens of languages. The shop itself transformed just as dramatically. Before the cameras arrived, it saw maybe 100 customers on a busy day. Within months of the premiere, that number had jumped into the hundreds, then the thousands. At its height, several thousand people were walking to the door daily. Tourists, collectors, curious fans who just wanted to see the counter where all those on-screen deals happened. Rick expanded the building multiple times, eventually growing it many times over its original size, and added an entire adjoining retail complex with restaurants and novelty shops built specifically to handle the crowds. What had started as a struggling storefront became one of the biggest non-casino tourist attractions in the entire city. Of course, none of what viewers saw was quite as spontaneous as it appeared. The shop's own staff eventually acknowledged that items were pre-screened by employees, then reviewed by producers who decided which ones were interesting enough to film. Sellers were often asked to return on specific filming days and given guidance on how to present themselves on camera. Producers have even confirmed that prices were frequently discussed with sellers ahead of time, ensuring the on-screen negotiation would actually lead somewhere instead of falling apart mid-take. The banter, the family bickering, the exaggerated frustration. Much it was shaped and encouraged by producers hunting for entertaining moments, sometimes even sweetening the edit to make arguments sound sharper than they really were. None of that meant the business itself was fake. The items were real, the money-changing hand was real, but the spontaneity audiences associated with the show was, in large part, manufactured for television. Even the people running the shop weren't immune to being fooled in real transactions. Richard once lost a substantial sum after being sold fake gemstones decades before the show existed. A younger cast member once bought a batch of counterfeit luxury, watches early in his career at the shop. Rick himself has spoken publicly about losing tens of thousands of dollars on jewelry that turned out to be tied to stolen credit information. Getting deceived, it turns out, was simply part doing business, camera or no camera. The financial rewards were enormous. Rick's net worth has been estimated in the range of $9 to $10 million, built from his majority ownership of the shop, his television paychecks, licensing deals, and book royalties. He bought and later sold a luxury home in one of the city's upscale communities for several $1 million. His younger co-star built his own fortune through merchandise sales and a candy shop he opened inside the retail plaza next door, eventually becoming the top seller of branded merchandise among the entire cast. But fame didn't shield the family from real hardship. In the summer of 2018, Richard passed away after a long, mostly private struggle with progressive illness that had kept him out of the spotlight in his final years. His death prompted an outpouring of tributes, a memorial special from the network, and a public farewell from Rick describing him as far more than a business partner, a father, a mentor, a friend. The peace didn't last. Details of Richard's estate later revealed that he had deliberately excluded his youngest son from any inheritance, citing a broken relationship without offering further explanation. Then, a few years later, Rick's own mother filed a lawsuit against him, alleging that it pressured her into signing over her majority stake in the business years earlier while she was incapacitated, and accusing him of withholding money owed to her from the estate. It was a bitter, very public family dispute, the kind that never made it onto the verge of the family the show sold audiences. Separately, one of the show's other cast members faced a serious legal scare years earlier when a police search of his home turned up unregistered weapons and illegal substances, resulting in numerous felony charges. He ultimately pleaded down to a single felony and a lesser charge, completed probation without incident, and had the more serious charge dismissed. But the incident lingered as a reminder of how much happened behind the scenes that never made it to air. Grief struck the family again in early 2024, when Rick's son was found dead at a relatively young age, with an official cause tied to a fatal combination of substances. He had struggled with addiction for years, and Rick has since spoken openly about the guilt and heartbreak of losing a child, describing it as a pain unlike anything else he's experienced. Then, in a separate and unrelated turn, one of the show's most recognizable younger cast members announced in late 2024 that he was leaving Las Vegas for good, not retiring from the business quietly, but relocating entirely to a coastal town in Mexico to start a barbecue restaurant, stepping away from both the shop and his television contract. It looked, for a while, like the beginning of a fresh chapter. Then came the accident. In January 2026, while riding a motorcycle near his new home, he was involved in a serious crash that left him with multiple broken ribs, a concussion, facial injuries, and internal bleeding severe enough to require several emergency surgeries. He spent more than 2 weeks hospitalized. The medical bills that followed were steep enough that he turned to public fundraising to help cover them, which led to some public disagreement over how much financial support he'd actually received from his father. Around the same time, his estimated net worth was reported to have collapsed to a small fraction of what it had once been, a stark contrast to the wealth associated with the family brand, even though he technically still retained a small ownership stake in the shop itself. None of these events, the lawsuits, the tragedies, the cast departure, the accident, have anything to do with the physical building being torn down. So, why did the rumors spread so widely? Part of it comes down to timing and geography. Las Vegas has been reshaping itself dramatically in recent years. Older casino landmarks have been demolished to make way for new developments, and a major resort nearby has been undergoing a massive rebrand and reconstruction. When people see that kind of upheaval happening nearby, it's easy to assume every familiar building in the area is at risk. Then there was a report from a local Vegas-focused outlet in early 2025 suggesting the flagship show itself might be ending its run, a claim that turned out to be premature, but one that planted the idea in a lot of people's minds that something big was wrapping up. Add to that the very real, very disruptive construction that had been happening directly along the boulevard where the shop sits. For years, crews worked on one of the largest infrastructure projects the city had undertaken, replacing decades-old water, sewer, and gas lines, widening sidewalks, adding new lighting, restoring historic neon signage, and modernizing the corridor. The work began around 2020 and wrapped up roughly 4 years later. For much of that stretch, anyone driving past saw exactly what you'd expect from major road work: barriers, heavy equipment block lanes, and a generally chaotic-looking stretch of street. To someone who didn't know the context, it looked less like an upgrade and more like the beginning of a demolition. A separate, unrelated road project further south, funded by the county rather than the city, added even more construction noise to the general area around the same period, though it had no connection whatsoever to the shop or its property. Put all of that together: family tragedy, a departing cast member's public struggles, a premature cancellation rumor, and years of visible construction work right outside the building. And it's easy to see how the pieces got assembled into a story that felt true, even though it wasn't. As of this year, the shop remains open, fully operational, and busy. It runs 7 days a week with a full staff of roughly 80 employees, and it still draws heavy foot traffic from tourists and collectors. Rick continues to show up in person, meet fans, sign merchandise, and actively grow the brand rather than wind it down. He and his longtime co-star launched a podcast recorded right inside the shop in early 2025, giving fans a new way to stay connected to that familiar setting. He also opened a new retail location inside one of the resorts on the actual Las Vegas Strip, his first real expansion onto that stretch of the city. Business inside the shop itself has reportedly stayed strong, with high demand for items like silver continuing well into 2026. There is no demolition order, no pending sale of the property, no government action threatening the building. The rumor that captured so much attention this year wasn't built on any single lie. It was built on a pile of real, unrelated events that, stacked together, created the impression of an ending. In reality, the family behind one of television's longest-running reality hits has weathered plenty: bankruptcy, lawsuits, addiction, grief, and a life-threatening accident. But the shop that started it all is still standing exactly where it's always been.